Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's program. I'm James Buchanan, the 15th President of the United States. Over the next 2 hours, I'll take you through the story of my life, sharing my experiences as president and the profound decisions I made in the face of a nation on the brink of collapse. My story isn't one of glory. Rather, it's filled with challenges, doubts, and personal choices that shaped the course of history. That I was born in 1791, during a time of great upheaval. I witnessed and played a part in a country undergoing monumental political, social, and cultural changes. My presidency, however, was marked by one of the most tumultuous periods in American history. On the eve of the Civil War, perhaps you're curious about my personal life, especially since I remain the only unmarried president in American history. While my private life has often been a subject of public intrigue, today I believe we will focus more on my political journey, especially how I navigated the complex issues that divided our nation. My time in office is not remembered as a period of great success. In fact, my decisions, my actions, are often criticized for failing to prevent the nation's division. But through this personal recount, I hope you will come to understand the dilemmas I faced, the choices I made, and the circumstances I could not control. As president, I tried to serve as a balance, a mediator between the North and the South, between the institution of slavery and the growing abolitionist movement. I did everything I could to seek compromise and preserve peace. Unfortunately, my efforts ultimately failed to prevent the war that would tear the country apart. I had hoped to leave a legacy that would impact America positively, but I was ultimately unable to steer the ship of state away from disaster. As we reflect on these events today, perhaps with a sense of regret, we must also recognize that the lessons learned during this time paved the way for the America that would emerge from the ashes of the Civil War. I am James Buchanan, and today, I will guide you through the story of my presidency, the trials I faced, and the choices I made during one of the most critical moments in American history. Let me take you back to the small town of Cove Gap, Pennsylvania, where I was born on April 23, 1791. The world I entered was very different from the one we know today. The United States was a young nation, still finding its footing after the Revolution, and my family was far from the political elite. My father, James Buchanan Sr., had emigrated from Ireland, driven by a desire for opportunity. Like many immigrants of that time, he came to America seeking a better life and soon established himself as a merchant. While we were by no means wealthy, we lived comfortably, and my father was a hard-working man with a strong sense of duty and discipline. My mother, Elizabeth Spear Buchanan, was a woman of great strength and character. She was deeply religious and instilled in me the importance of values such as honesty, humility, and responsibility. Though my father was the provider, it was my mother who played a central role in shaping my early character. I remember her quiet strength, her determination, and her unwavering belief in the importance of knowledge. Education was a cherished value in our household, and it wasn't long before I was enrolled in local schools. At the age of 12, my parents sent me to the Old Stone Academy, a local institution that would become the foundation of my formal education. It wasn't a prestigious school by any means, but it was a place where I could begin to cultivate my mind. I remember spending long hours in the dusty classrooms, reading classical works in Latin and Greek. While some children my age would have rather been outside playing, I found myself drawn to the challenge of learning. The curriculum was rigorous, and I quickly developed a passion for languages and literature. Even at that young age, I could feel the tug of ambition within me, the desire to do something significant with my life. However, it wasn't all smooth sailing. Like many young students, I faced difficulties along the way. The demands of Latin and Greek were particularly challenging at first, and I often struggled to keep up with my classmates. But the lessons I learned during that time, persistence, resilience, and the importance of never giving up, would stay with me throughout my life. It was in those early years of struggle that I learned the value of hard work and determination, principles that would guide me as I entered the political arena later on. At 16, I left home to attend Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. I had heard much about the college, and it was known as a place that produced some of the brightest minds in the state. The transition to college life was daunting, and I was far from the most confident freshman. It was a world of intellectuals, people with different ideas and worldviews. Yet I quickly became absorbed in my studies, throwing myself into the pursuit of knowledge with the same passion I had for languages back in the academy. Dickinson College was a formative experience for me. I found my intellectual footing here and realized that my education wasn't just about learning facts. It was about developing the critical thinking and reasoning skills that would become essential in my future career. I majored in the classics and spent countless hours poring over ancient texts. Some of my professors were strict and demanding, but they saw potential in me, and that made a difference. I wasn't the most brilliant student in the class, but I worked hard and applied myself with determination. I graduated in 1809 with a Bachelor of Arts degree, feeling both accomplished and eager to enter the next chapter of my life. But my education didn't stop at graduation. The world of law beckoned. Upon returning to Lancaster, I decided to pursue a career in law, enrolling in the office of John Reed, a well-respected lawyer in the area. My legal training was intense, and I found myself immersed in casebooks, precedents, and the intricacies of legal argumentation. At first, I was a bit intimidated by the world of law. It was a challenging field, filled with sharp minds and fierce competition. Yet, as with my academic journey, I persevered. Within a few years, I established my own law practice in Lancaster, quickly gaining a reputation for my meticulous attention to detail and my ability to present a compelling case in court. Although my legal career began to thrive, I could never shake the feeling that I was meant for something more. The world of politics had always fascinated me, and I found myself drawn to the idea of serving the public. But I didn't rush into it. I knew that I needed to continue refining my skills, gaining experience, and understanding the needs of the people. Little did I know at the time, my future in politics would soon beckon, and my journey would take me far beyond the courtroom. Now that I've shared a bit about my early life and education, let's move forward to a pivotal moment in my journey, the moment I decided to enter the political arena. It's hard to pinpoint the exact moment when politics became my true calling, but looking back, I can see the gradual evolution that led me to this path. After establishing myself as a successful lawyer in Lancaster, I became increasingly aware of the political currents shaping my country. The nation was young, and the issues it faced were significant. As a lawyer, I had the opportunity to interact with influential people in my community, and I began to hear the debates that were raging about the future of America. The idea of a republic where elected officials represented the will of the people deeply resonated with me. In the early 1820s, I found myself increasingly engaged in these discussions. My growing interest in politics was not just about the power or prestige it might offer. It was about my desire to shape the nation's future. The question of how to maintain unity in a diverse and expanding republic was becoming more pressing by the day. I had always believed in the ideals of the Founding Fathers, the principles of liberty, equality, and the rule of law, but I soon realized that these principles were being tested in ways I hadn't fully understood. In 1820, my political career took its first significant step when I was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives as a member of the Federalist Party. I had no grand illusions about politics at the time. I entered Congress not with the idea of making a name for myself, but with the belief that I could help guide the country through its growing pains. The Federalists were a dying breed by then, and the Democratic Republicans were firmly in control, but my desire to serve remained unshaken. During my first years in the House, I focused on the issues that most directly impacted the people I represented. I supported protective tariffs to help the nation's emerging industries, advocated for internal improvements like roads and canals, and worked to improve the education system. These issues weren't glamorous or groundbreaking, but they mattered to the everyday lives of Americans. I was still learning the intricacies of national politics, but I was beginning to see how laws were made and how decisions shaped the lives of millions. By 1828, I had shifted to the Democratic Party, aligning myself with Andrew Jackson's populist vision. This was a crucial moment in my political career, as Jackson was becoming a force to be reckoned with, and his rise to the presidency marked the beginning of a new political era in America. Jackson's vision of a strong presidency and a more direct relationship between the people and their government resonated with me. I admired his determination and his willingness to stand up for what he believed in. Even when it wasn't popular. In 1834, I was appointed by President Jackson as the U.S. Minister to the United Kingdom, a post that would change my life in many ways. The role was prestigious, and my tenure in London helped me develop a broader understanding of international relations. I had the opportunity to represent American interests in a foreign land, and I found myself deeply immersed in the complexities of diplomacy. My time in England exposed me to the intricacies of global politics and gave me a deeper appreciation for the role of the United States on the world stage. This diplomatic experience, though far removed from the everyday struggles of American politics, helped shape my views on the country's role in the world. It made me realize that the nation was not an isolated entity. It was a part of a larger global community, and we had to find our place within it. I forged important relationships with British officials and gained valuable insights into how the United States was perceived abroad. In 1845, I returned to the United States, and, not long after, I was elected to the U.S. Senate, where I would serve for several terms. My time in the Senate was marked by a growing realization that the issue of slavery was no longer something that could be ignored or avoided. The tensions between the North and South were becoming more pronounced, and I found myself in the middle of debates that would shape the future of the nation. It was during these years that I began to recognize that, despite my best efforts to avoid it, the nation's division over slavery was inevitable. I had hoped that compromise could hold the Union together, but the forces pulling the country apart were too powerful. Slavery was the ticking time bomb at the heart of the nation's politics, and no matter how much I tried to appease both sides, I could not deny that the nation was heading toward an irreconcilable conflict. Now that I've shared a bit about my early life and education, let's move forward to a pivotal moment in my journey, the moment I decided to enter the political arena. It's hard to pinpoint the exact moment when politics became my true calling, but looking back, I can see the gradual evolution that led me to this path. After establishing myself as a successful lawyer in Lancaster, I became increasingly aware of the political currents shaping my country. The nation was young, and the issues it faced were significant. As a lawyer, I had the opportunity to interact with influential people in my community, and I began to hear the debates that were raging about the future of America. The idea of a republic where elected officials represented the will of the people deeply resonated with me. In the early 1820s, I found myself increasingly engaged in these discussions. My growing interest in politics was not just about the power or prestige it might offer. It was about my desire to shape the nation's future. The question of how to maintain unity in a diverse and expanding republic was becoming more pressing by the day. I had always believed in the ideals of the Founding Fathers, the principles of liberty, equality, and the rule of law, but I soon realized that these principles were being tested in ways I hadn't fully understood. In 1820, my political career took its first significant step when I was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives as a member of the Federalist Party. I had no grand illusions about politics at the time. I entered Congress not with the idea of making a name for myself, but with the belief that I could help guide the country through its growing pains. The Federalists were a dying breed by then, and the Democratic Republicans were firmly in control, but my desire to serve remained unshaken. During my first years in the House, I focused on the issues that most directly impacted the people I represented. I supported protective tariffs to help the nation's emerging industries, advocated for internal improvements like roads and canals, and worked to improve the education system. These issues weren't glamorous or groundbreaking, but they mattered to the everyday lives of Americans. I was still learning the intricacies of national politics, but I was beginning to see how laws were made and how decisions shaped the lives of millions. By 1828, I had shifted to the Democratic Party, aligning myself with Andrew Jackson's populist vision. This was a crucial moment in my political career, as Jackson was becoming a force to be reckoned with, and his rise to the presidency marked the beginning of a new political era in America. Jackson's vision of a strong presidency and a more direct relationship between the people and their government resonated with me. I admired his determination and his willingness to stand up for what he believed in. Even when it wasn't popular. In 1834, I was appointed by President Jackson as the U.S. Minister to the United Kingdom, a post that would change my life in many ways. The role was prestigious, and my tenure in London helped me develop a broader understanding of international relations. I had the opportunity to represent American interests in a foreign land, and I found myself deeply immersed in the complexities of diplomacy. My time in England exposed me to the intricacies of global politics and gave me a deeper appreciation for the role of the United States on the world stage. This diplomatic experience, though far removed from the everyday struggles of American politics, helped shape my views on the country's role in the world. It made me realize that the nation was not an isolated entity. It was a part of a larger global community, and we had to find our place within it. I forged important relationships with British officials and gained valuable insights into how the United States was perceived abroad. In 1845, I returned to the United States, and, not long after, I was elected to the U.S. Senate, where I would serve for several terms. My time in the Senate was marked by a growing realization that the issue of slavery was no longer something that could be ignored or avoided. The tensions between the North and South were becoming more pronounced, and I found myself in the middle of debates that would shape the future of the nation. It was during these years that I began to recognize that, despite my best efforts to avoid it, the nation's division over slavery was inevitable. I had hoped that compromise could hold the Union together, but the forces pulling the country apart were too powerful. Slavery was the ticking time bomb at the heart of the nation's politics, and no matter how much I tried to appease both sides, I could not deny that the nation was heading toward an irreconcilable conflict. When I assumed office in March 1857, the weight of the presidency felt heavier than ever. The nation was on the brink of division, and the problems we faced seemed insurmountable. I stepped into the role with the belief that I could steer the ship of state through these troubled waters. But the challenges were overwhelming, and the solutions were elusive. It was a time when the United States desperately needed a leader who could unify the country. Unfortunately, I would soon learn that the divisions I inherited could not be healed by mere political maneuvering. At the outset of my presidency, I was determined to maintain the delicate balance between the North and the South. I understood that the slavery question was the root of the nation's crisis, but I believed that a constitutional solution could be found. I had long held the view that the best way to preserve the Union was through compromise, and I hoped that my diplomatic skills could bring about the necessary reconciliation. One of my first significant actions as president was to deal with the ongoing tensions surrounding Kansas. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 had opened the Western territories to the possibility of slavery, leading to violent clashes between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. Known as Bleeding Kansas, this conflict was a microcosm of the larger national struggle over slavery. The violence in Kansas was escalating, and it was clear that the federal government needed to intervene. I believed that the issue of Kansas should be settled through popular sovereignty, the idea that the settlers of a territory should decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. However, the situation in Kansas had become so volatile that any action I took was bound to be controversial. Despite my efforts to support the territorial government and prevent further violence, the conflict only intensified. The violence in Kansas was a bitter reminder of how deeply entrenched the divisions over slavery had become and how little I was able to do to stop it. Another critical issue I faced during my presidency was the economic depression that began in 1857. The Panic of 1857 was a financial crisis that spread throughout the country, plunging the nation into a deep recession. The panic was triggered by the collapse of a major financial institution, and it affected both the North and South. Unemployment soared, banks failed, and the economy ground to a halt. The Depression exacerbated existing tensions, and many Americans looked to the federal government for relief. As president, I believe that the best response to the crisis was to uphold the principles of limited government. I was a firm believer in the idea that the government should not interfere with the economy, and I resisted calls for direct intervention. I proposed a series of measures aimed at stabilizing the economy, including support for the railroads and the establishment of a national bank. However, my reluctance to take bold action in the face of the crisis was widely criticized, and I was unable to alleviate the suffering of millions of Americans. Perhaps the most significant challenge of my presidency, however, was the escalating crisis over slavery. The Dred Scott decision, handed down by the Supreme Court in 1857, was a pivotal moment in American history. The court ruled that African Americans, whether free or enslaved, could not be considered citizens of the United States. Moreover, the court declared that the federal government had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. This ruling was a devastating blow to the anti-slavery movement, and it further inflamed tensions between the North and the South that I supported the Dred Scott decision, believing that it upheld the constitutional rights of slaveholders and protected the institution of slavery. I thought that by supporting the decision, I could calm the South and prevent further secessionist sentiment. However, the ruling only deepened the divide. The North saw it as a betrayal, while the South felt emboldened. The decision drove the country even closer to the edge of war. Despite these setbacks, I remained steadfast in my belief that the Union could be preserved through compromise. I continued to push for policies that I thought would resolve the nation's crises, including efforts to balance the power of the federal government with states' rights. However, my presidency increasingly felt like a series of unsuccessful attempts to quell a storm that was already raging out of control. In 1860, just 3 years after I left office, the nation would finally be pushed to the breaking point. The election of Abraham Lincoln and the secession of Southern states would mark the beginning of the Civil War, a war that I had desperately tried to avoid. My presidency had failed to avert this catastrophe, and I left office with a sense of defeat, knowing that the Union I had worked so hard to preserve was now on the brink of collapse. As the election of 1860 approached, I knew in my heart that the future of the nation was hanging by a thread. I had done all I could to prevent the country from tearing apart, but it seemed as though the forces of division were simply too powerful to contain. My presidency, once filled with hopes of compromise, had become a bitter series of failures. I had tried to bridge the chasm between North and South, but each attempt seemed to widen it further. One of the most difficult moments of my final year in office was the secession crisis. In December 1860, South Carolina became the first state to secede from the Union, followed by several other Southern states. They feared that the election of Abraham Lincoln, who had made it clear that he opposed the expansion of slavery, would mark the beginning of the end for their way of life. The idea of secession had been a threat for years, but now it was becoming a reality. I could feel the weight of history pressing down on me. I knew that my efforts to preserve the Union had failed, and the decision to secede would ultimately lead to the conflict I had worked so hard to avoid. I appealed to the Southern states, urging them to reconsider, but my words fell on deaf ears. The path to war was now set, and nothing I could say or do would change that. The country I had worked my entire life to help build was on the brink of destruction. I spent my final months in office trying to maintain order and prepare for what I feared would be an inevitable war. I continued to believe that a peaceful resolution could still be found, but the Southern states were determined to secede, and their anger toward the federal government was growing by the day. My attempts to hold the Union together through legal means, through compromise, were no longer enough. By the time Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated as the 16th president on March 4, 1861, I had already left office. I had done my best to prepare him for the monumental task ahead, but I knew the road would be incredibly difficult. Lincoln's election had caused a seismic shift in the country, and his position on slavery and Union preservation was seen by the South as a direct threat. The Confederacy had already been formed by the time I handed over the reins of power, and it was clear that war was no longer avoidable. As I left office and retreated to my home in Pennsylvania, I could not escape the sense of failure that haunted me. I had hoped that my leadership would guide the nation through its darkest period, but instead, I had presided over the unraveling of the Union. I was the last president to serve before the outbreak of the Civil War, and as I looked back on my time in office, I could not shake the feeling that I had done too little, too late. As I retired to my home in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, after leaving office, I thought little of the political world that I had just left behind. I spent my final years in relative solitude, reflecting on the decisions I had made and the nation I had tried so hard to preserve. I was often approached by friends and former colleagues, but I rarely spoke of my presidency. The weight of failure was too heavy to bear, and I knew that my time in office had not brought the peace or unity that I had hoped for. For years, I had fought for the preservation of the Union, believing that compromise was the key to resolving the nation's problems. I advocated for popular sovereignty, the idea that the settlers of new territories should decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. I believed in states' rights, and I hoped that the federal government could stand as a neutral force, balancing the interests of both the North and the South. But in the end, None of these efforts succeeded in preventing the coming storm. The divisions I had hoped to bridge had only deepened, and the nation had collapsed into civil war. As I watched the country erupt into conflict, I could not help but feel that I had been an unwilling participant in the events that led to the war. Many of my contemporaries, particularly those in the South, saw me as a man who had stood by their side, defending their interests and the institution of slavery. But the truth is more complicated. I was not an ardent supporter of slavery. I did not believe in its expansion into the territories, but I did believe in the importance of maintaining the Union. I believed that compromise was still possible, that a middle ground could be found that would keep the country intact. Unfortunately, history does not always favor those who seek compromise. The forces of division had long been set in motion, and no amount of diplomacy or legal maneuvering could stop the tide of history. I had hoped that my time in office would be remembered for my efforts to avoid war, to preserve the Union, and to maintain peace. But instead, I became known as the president who failed to prevent the Civil War, the man who watched helplessly as the nation tore itself apart. In the years after the war, my legacy remained deeply controversial. Some historians and political figures viewed my presidency as a failure, citing my inability to prevent secession and my support for the Dred Scott decision. My decision to support the Supreme Court ruling that African Americans could not be citizens and that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories is perhaps the most damning aspect of my presidency. It was a decision that alienated many in the North and bolstered the belief among Southerners that they were justified in their desire to preserve slavery. For years, I was labeled a weak president, one who had been too timid in the face of national crises. Some called me the lame duck president, referring to the fact that I had little political power in my final years in office. My own party, which had once placed its trust in me, had all but abandoned me by the time I left office. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 marked the end of my political influence, and I became a footnote in the history of a nation at war. But as I reflect now, from the distance of history, I realize that my presidency was not simply defined by the failure to prevent war. It was a time of great national stress, and I faced decisions that no leader before or after me would have wanted to confront. Perhaps if I had made different decisions, the outcome would have been the same. Perhaps the forces of history were simply too powerful for anyone to control that I did not live to see the full extent of the consequences of the Civil War. But in the years following my death in 1868, I came to be viewed by some as a tragic figure, an earnest man who, in his efforts to hold the Union together, found himself unable to bridge the ideological chasm that had divided the nation. I was a man who lived in a time of immense change and conflict, and I did what I could with the tools available to me. My failures, my compromises, and my mistakes were not in vain. They were a part of the broader history of America, a history that ultimately resulted in the end of slavery and the preservation of the Union. Today, I am remembered as a man who failed to prevent the Civil War, but I hope that history will also recognize the complexity of my presidency. I was not a man who shirked from difficult decisions, nor was I a man who lacked conviction. I was a man of my time, and the times I faced were extraordinary. If there is any lesson to be learned from my life, it is this: sometimes, no matter how hard we try, history moves forward, and we must accept the consequences of our actions. As I sit in the quiet of my later years, away from the tumult of Washington and the noise of politics, I have come to terms with the role I played in the great American experiment. The years since I left office have been filled with reflection, not just on my own actions, but on the course of the nation that I served. History has not been kind to me. I am often remembered as the president who failed to prevent the Civil War, the man who saw the country fracture and did nothing substantial to stop it. My presidency is often seen through the lens of my inability to reconcile the stark differences between the North and South, my inability to keep the Union intact during the most precarious period in its history. But perhaps my story is not one of simple failure. Perhaps it is a cautionary tale about the limits of compromise in a nation divided by deep moral, political, and economic fault lines. Perhaps it is a story about the unintended consequences of trying to preserve a system at the expense of justice and equality. The America I inherited in 1857 was a nation struggling to hold on to ideals of democracy and freedom while ignoring the profound contradiction of slavery that was at the heart of our political system that I in my time. I believed that the preservation of the Union could be achieved through compromise, that the wounds of division could be healed with negotiation. I fought to maintain peace, to avoid war, to find a middle ground. But in doing so, I ignored the growing calls for justice from the abolitionist movement, and I failed to see that some issues, like slavery, could not be compromised upon. Some issues demand a clear stand, a firm belief in right and wrong, and perhaps that was where my leadership faltered. The Dred Scott decision, for example, is often cited as one of my greatest failures. By supporting it, I believed I was upholding the rights of Southern slaveholders and protecting the status quo. I thought it would calm tensions, but instead, it inflamed them. In my desire to preserve peace and avoid confrontation, I inadvertently contributed to the very forces that would tear the nation apart. It was a decision that sealed my place in history, not as a man who united the country, but as one who failed to steer it away from catastrophe. However, in my final years, I have come to understand that my presidency was not solely defined by my failures. In times of crisis, leaders must make decisions with the information available to them, and no one could have fully predicted how deeply the conflict over slavery would shape our nation's future. What I failed to see, others had already seen. Slavery was a moral wrong, and its existence in a nation founded on liberty and equality was untenable. The Civil War came, and it was a war that I had hoped to avoid. Yet, in hindsight, I realized it was perhaps inevitable. The forces of history, the clash of cultures, economies, and ideals, had already set their course. I was but a brief interlude in that grand historical drama, an earnest leader in a time when compromise was not enough to hold together a nation at war with itself. If history has taught me anything, it is that some things cannot be compromised. Freedom and justice are not negotiable. The lessons of my presidency, tragic as they are, helped to inform the decisions of those who followed. Abraham Lincoln, with his firm belief in the preservation of the Union and his resolve to end slavery, took the country in the direction I could not. The war that followed my presidency was a necessary conflict, a fight for the soul of the nation. Though my time in office was marred by failure, I take some solace in knowing that the Union ultimately survived and slavery was abolished. My decisions, for all their flaws, were part of the complex tapestry of American history, a history that is still unfolding today. I may not have been the man to save the Union, but I hope that my story serves as a reminder of the challenges faced by those who come before us and the difficult choices they must make in times of crisis. I am James Buchanan, and though history may not judge me kindly, I hope that one day, in the fullness of time, my efforts to preserve peace and the Union will be seen in the context of a nation on the brink of war, a nation that, despite all its divisions, was ultimately made stronger by its trials. Perhaps, in the end, my greatest contribution to history was not my presidency, but the lessons that came from its failure.